I think we have to look at this in all aspects of our online presence. For me, the podcast is simply just one pillar of that. So my criteria for the podcast is pretty low in a sense. Like I said, it's more people that want to say yes because I see it somewhat as the networking event of my business.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
Welcome back to the podcast on podcasting. It's your friend, Adam, AAA Adams, and stoked because today is an interview episode, which means I have Mike Ficara on the show, and he's been doing his podcast for 2.5 years. So there's a few things you're going to learn from Mike. That's for sure. His podcast is called the Start Down Podcast. And guess what I did for you? It's already in the show notes. So you could scroll down, click on it, and go directly over to his podcast. So that's where it's going to be found when you're ready. And additionally, I will say this just in case you hear it and it bothers you. His son is sick. And so actually, I think in the room with you, is that right, Mike?
Yeah, he is.
He's been instructed to be quiet.
Yes, good so far.
But that never happens. That never happens perfectly. Why is he home with you today?
Typical thing at school nowadays. He got a little bit sick and threw up, and so you got to run and get him. So it's a brave new world.
Yeah.
But that's okay.
My gosh. That happened with my youngest. Anything that happens, they're like, sorry, he can't be here because it could be COVID related and all that jazz. What part of the country do you live in again?
So I'm in sunny South Florida.
South Florida. Epic.
Yeah.
So not that we need to put a timestamp on us recording, but we're recording when it was 6 degrees when I woke up, Fahrenheit, 6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's like negative 15, I think, in Celsius. And so I bet you anything, it's not like that in South Florida.
No, and it's funny. You always want what you don't have, right? Like I was born and raised here, so I'm like dying to move to a cold weather climate. And my kids, one of their Christmas list items was to go see snow. So wow. the grass is literally always greener or whiter in this case, I guess, on the other side.
It hailed, rained, and snowed this morning.
There you go, the trifecta.
The hail was going like practically sideways. And my son, who went to school today because he wasn't sick, luckily, my son would not let me drive him to the bus stop. He is 10 and he wants to be like strong and seen like that he doesn't care about opposition. And I kept telling him, it's not about you, son. Your bus driver's going to judge me if I don't take you to the bus stop. So anyway, just random. So you started this podcast like a little over 2 years ago. You've got like 150 episodes out right now. I am curious a couple of things. Number one, what made you decide to start the podcast? Like that's really my biggest question. Was there people telling you had to do it? Was it for your business? Was it for leaving a legacy? What was really going through your mind 2.5 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think like most things that go through my mind, it's kind of like just bouncing around, right? I had actually done a podcast many, many years ago when I was teaching. I was a teacher in high school, and it was one of the ways I actually used to get content out to my students so we could have a little more time engaging and having conversation in class. I actually did all of my lectures and some things actually had a podcast coming out. So it's something after I stopped teaching and got into entrepreneurship, I always wanted to get back to. It actually came out of it. And I'm sure, a lot of people are going to cringe when they hear this, cover your ears, but it started off doing Facebook Lives. And then it was just another way for me to distribute them out. So a good portion of the early probably dozen episodes. So just my Facebook Lives, I converted into a podcast episode. And after that, I really, from there on, was like, wait a second, I really want to do this right, and really started to look at it and put it together because 2 reasons. Number one, I'm in marketing, and I often tell my clients podcasting is a great way to reach an audience that maybe you're not communicating with and get your message and your brand out there as well. And more importantly, I kind of want to eat my own dog food. For those of you who aren't watching this and just listening, I have a face for radio. So that was the other reason why I kind of went into this. And thirdly, I think it is legacy. Really kid around always and say, well, I know my mom's listening. But I think, putting all this content out there, social media posts, writing articles, having a podcast, it's just who's going to look at it, and whether it's now or whether it's sometime down the line. I just really, and I enjoy it. It allows me to have great conversations and engage with great people like yourself. So kind of a long-winded answer there, but that's a little bit of it in a nutshell.
A long time ago, Mike, I had this other podcast about real estate investing. I was just at some conference and I sat down with this engineer. His name's Siva, and he ended up I think I purposefully mentioned to him that I had a podcast. Like, here's the thing. I didn't have very many listeners back then. Like, the day that I was sitting down with Siva, I didn't really have a strong listener base. But the interesting thing with Siva is I was able to kind of like naturally mention to him that one of my episodes either solved a problem or answered a question or went into more detail on something that we were talking about. So I just basically said, hey, I've got this episode. Siva listens to he called me a few months later and he says, hey, Adam, I just want to let you know that I listened to like 60 of your episodes and now I want to work with you. In that case, I was operating deals and he was going to be a passive investor, basically like put his money with us so we could do more deals. And that was like a hidden benefit for me to having a podcast, even though I didn't have listeners. And I just want to find out from you, like, do you have a story or an example of something that your podcast has done? I mean, you've got over 150 episodes out right now. So obviously it's doing something for you. But I'm wondering if there is something that it's doing for you that you never actually expected, like that thing with Siva when I didn't even have listeners and I was able to get a really good person to work with. Could you share like a story of something like that from your show?
Yeah, it's funny you say that because you really never know who's listening, right? And for me, it's in some ways, it's become like a really great masterclass for me. I didn't expect to learn as much as I did. You put it out there and I've really been, I think, especially with COVID, the ability to network. I love in-person events. I love going to see people. I love going to do things. And what I noticed was that I kind of now was able to meet a lot of different people and kind of learn the things I want to learn by having guests on my show. So I really, in some ways, and this is somewhat of a selfish thing, had that benefit come out of it and was able to do that. And a lot of like what you said, now when I go out to events, though, now that things are opening back up, because I've had sort of such a diverse audience and a lot of things that I think I wanted to learn, other people wanted to learn. Great example is I had a good friend of mine who's involved in various different types of businesses. And he says, yeah, I listen to your podcast regularly. And every time I'm in a meeting, he goes, something that you say comes up when we're talking about that he heard from a guest, whether it's a marketing strategy or tactic in business. He says, I hear so many just like little nuggets. He goes, and I love that. And then the other thing is walked into a couple of conferences now where I bumped into people that I've casually met before. And now I'm seeing them again for a second time. And because we met, they kind of connected with me on LinkedIn or they connected with me on Instagram. And then they started listening to it. And we just had a deeper relationship than the first time I met them. And to give you just one story, it happens so often because it just seems like now when we network, there was such a downtime due to COVID that people were consuming the content that much more. So it's happened when I've gone to industry trade shows. It's happened when I've gone to Chamber of Commerce meetings. You just feel a little bit closer to people now because they've listened to your podcast.
Hidden benefits was like, it's kind of been a masterclass. Maybe you didn't expect that, but you can have almost anybody on your podcast that you want. You can ask them anything that you want. You're learning a lot from them. You're connecting with them. So that's huge. And the second one is that it has seemed to benefit you when you're going to a conference. Other people go to a conference and they don't have a show. They don't have like a thought leadership platform and they have a hard time. They have a hard time connecting with others. They have a hard time like interjecting. They have a hard time because they don't really have the authority. They don't really have like the recognition. So they're kind of starting from scratch every conference they go to. But for you, when you go to these conferences, you get a few people that actually come up to you and say, oh my gosh, Mike Ficara, I listened to your podcast. I heard you on the show. And so it's supporting your networking in a big way as well. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's social proof, right? It all comes down to that. I think with the LinkedIn profile, it's easy, right? It's easy to put text and words. And I think, like I said, coming from that teaching background, everyone learns in a different way. For you, it may be reading things. For me, I'm terrible at like people are like, oh, you have a grammatical error on your social media post. I'm like, I don't care. Like that's part of my brand. I'm not good at spelling and grammar and all that. I don't do that. But someone may look at that and be like, well, Mike's not that smart then. But they hear me on my podcast, they see me on my videos, and they're like, oh, no, he does know what he's talking about. And it gives me another opportunity to be credible. And I really do believe that credibility and the spoken word of being able to put that out there has been a big advantage for me with the podcast. Because a lot of people are like, well, fix the typo or fix this or fix that. I'm like, I just don't care. I'm like, that's a part of my brand because we're meant to be imperfect, but I have strengths in other areas where I've met some very good grammatically correct people who can't get on 2 words out on a podcast, right?
Yeah.
So it's a catch-22. And I think it just gives you another opportunity to connect with people on a medium that maybe they're comfortable with, where they may have seen me, maybe they just don't like reading your really long LinkedIn profile or reading an article, but they do see me then on a podcast. And it's just a different way to connect.
It's pretty challenging to like read some of those like LinkedIn profiles when you're on a run. Or when you're like cooking dinner for your kids or like you're on a road trip, it's kind of hard to like read someone's profile when you're driving, right? So it's kind of cool because it's also pretty easily consumable for your listener. Like they'll be able to still get to know you, learn from you. You're seen as thought leader. You're adding value to their life. They're getting to know who you are as a person, and they're more likely to do business with you. And they can do it while they do some of the other stuff too.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, like you said, too, it gives you a great way to point to an example to kind of prove a point, right? Like if you want to say, hey, I really think you need to be doing more on LinkedIn because that's the next generation platform. Or I think you need to have a podcast. And listen, don't take it from me just because I have a podcast. I had Adam on who also shared a lot of great points about why you should have a podcast. Listen to him. It lets you sort of step outside of yourself. That's what I love about having guests too on. The solo episodes are a lot of fun, but I love having the guests on because it lets me say, hey, look, it's not just me saying this. Here's someone that I'm not even connected to, just had him as a guest. And they're going to give that social proof as well. So I think it's really easy to sort of look at that idea of what can we do to sort of give people examples that are outside of us. I think a lot of times in sales, we want to convince people that they should buy from us. It's like, well, just don't listen to me, then listen to this other person.
I want to ask you a question, Mike, based on what you just mentioned about like having guests on and some of the benefits that you mentioned. And I've never done this on another episode, but it just seems like it's like the right question to ask. And it's basically like about guests. And you know how people say who, when, where, why, how, what, all the W and H questions. So it's actually that. That's what I'm curious about with you and guests. So I want to ask, who are your guests? How do you get the guests? Why do you choose those people as your guests? Like, what is the motivation that they should be your guest? When do you record those episodes? Is there a certain day? And how do you record? Do they have to come to your house to record, or are you doing it virtually? So starting with, who is your guest? Who is that person that you're selecting that's going to be a guest for your show? Which I covered it up and my brain is just silly sometimes. The Start Down podcast. So who is that guest is the number one question.
Yeah, like I said, I think my brain's a little slow too, so I may need you to run through all those again. But we'll start with who are you guys? I really try to focus on, obviously, like I said, I'm in marketing, I'm in kind of business strategy. So that's who I focus on. Entrepreneurs, business owners, people that are in the field, people that have kind of done it. I call it the start down because to me, the startup is easy, right? Having a startup is easy. It's an idea, it's a thought. But the start down is when we actually get to work. And I have people that have done it or in the trenches. I love the story of people who are phoenixes who rise from the ashes. I love hearing those stories. I love the phoenix that are sometimes in the ashes. I've had guests in those spots. And a lot of times that's who's on. And sometimes they're in marketing, sometimes they're in real estate, sometimes they're in, I had a gentleman on last week who has amusement parks in Orlando and Las Vegas, or like amusement activities and oxygen bars. So it's just a variety of different entrepreneurs, because I really believe that's how we learn best, is hearing from different people. And I would say it's kind of like a buffet. You take what you need and you leave the rest. But that's kind of who the guests are. The next one was, where do I get them? Correct?
That's not how I go to buffets though, Mike. I go to buffets and I say, I spent 12 whole entire dollars for all you can eat, so I'm going to eat it all. That's how I go to buffets.
Yeah, that's an epic failure, though. See, because my kids have I taught them, because we live in Florida, we go to Orlando, right? And the buffets are much more expensive than $12. But it's like,
I'm going to the wrong buffets, obviously.
Yeah. It's like $30. Okay, but
Chuck-a-rama, that's where I go.
Yeah, that's what everyone does, right? They pile their plate on. They pile up as much food as they can. I say, my kids know we go round one. What's round one? We just get a little bit of an appetizer thing or something like that. Then we go for round two, and then we go for round three. So we probably ended up eating more food than most people, but we don't go and glutton it, right? A lot of people go to the buffet and they just throw a lot on, or they're like, yeah, we're going to get as much as we can. I'm big on kind of taking my time. And that's why I'm like, hey, you miss it, don't worry. You don't get something, you mix too much. So we go, it's so funny you say that, because that's kind of like my thing that my kids always know, is that's kind of our methodology with the buffets. And I agree with you sometimes too. It's like, and I think that's an interesting business thing, right? We have to learn, when should we be getting maximum value and when should we be getting just enough? And that's a tough lesson to learn, right? Like, I think there's a lot of gray areas there, but you bring up a good point. When do you go to the buffet and go all out? And when do you try to get just maximum value, maybe of the satiation of hunger? And I know that's probably the word, satisfying your hunger more than the value for the dollar. That's a tough balance. But I'm a fat guy, so I always eat too much.
Dude, I have to say this. It's on my mind. I've been kicked out of 2 all-you-can-eat sushi restaurants.
Nice.
One of the times I got kicked out and they wouldn't even let me finish. Like, I could have eaten twice as much as I had eaten. And they told me I wasn't welcome back because I ate so much food, right?
Wow.
And when their management turned over 2 years later, I went back to the same place and I was so scared. I was so afraid. I walked in, I thought I was going to get kicked out immediately. And I ate at least $400 of sushi. And I'm like, are you going to kick me out? And they're like, no, why would we kick you out? This is all you can eat. I'm like, well, I keep getting kicked out and I'm just starting to get stuffed. And I've obviously eaten more than my $40 worth or 30 or whatever it was. Anyway, I can eat too. My son thinks I'm fat. I don't think I'm fat, but I definitely am fat at heart. I definitely eat.
I love that.
Gluttonously, but that is probably not a word. Let's move on.
It's our word now. It's our word now. So,
so who you have on your podcast is entrepreneurs. It's people who've done it or they're currently in the trenches. How do you find them? Like, basically, how do you get them on your podcast? How do you find them? Because I know a lot of people that are thinking about starting a podcast, that is like the hardest thing to do. They're like, how am I going to get a guest on my show? They don't want to come on my show. So what have you learned there?
So two things. Everyone's a potential guest. I think it's like dating. The worst thing they could say is no. I found a lot of my guests initially from my immediate network, obviously friends, coworkers, people that maybe wanted exposure, clients. That was kind of the initial. Once I tapped that network, then obviously I went to social media and just threw the line out there. Hey, does anyone want to be on my podcast? Is anyone interested in coming on the show? I would get a few people there. I've started to, and then obviously there's websites. One I go to is called Podbooker. So I've gone on there and registered my podcast and then also been able to find a lot of great guests there. So I get people reaching out to me. And then my favorite one though, Adam, is now I have former guests sending me people. So I love that I'm getting the recommendation from my guests. And I usually say to someone when I have them on their show, or if I'm on someone's show, so like, hey, I'd love to have you on my podcast. Or if you know anyone, any great guests that you have that you think would be a benefit to be on my podcast, they send them my way as well. So really now it's become a lot of, I would say the two main sources are kind of referral and Podbooker are really where I'm getting most of my guests.
Amazing. I can't wait to wrap up this episode and mention the takeaways that I just got from you on how to get those guests on. That was just so dialed in. So why do you choose these entrepreneurs as your guests? Like, how does having them as guests benefit you or benefit your podcast or benefit like your listener? Why choose entrepreneurs? Why not somebody else?
Much like marrying my wife, because they said yes. Really, I think, listen, that's the environment I'm in. A lot of times I think it's entrepreneurs just because I really feel that that's the group we can learn from the most. And I think the definition's so broad. I've had non-entrepreneurs on before, so I've had celebrities. And it's funny because bringing them on, even one of my favorite shows is The Sopranos. I don't know if you've ever seen or heard of it. Great HBO show. I had Joe Gannascoli on. And I just asked and he came on, but then like wanted to talk about The Sopranos, but he also shared some of his entrepreneurial journeys I didn't even know he had. So I think everyone's got a little bit of entrepreneur in them at heart, but I think the value is because that's who I work with in all honesty. I mean, that's my community. That's my people. Just like, why would I not go to a networking event for skydivers? Because I don't skydive, So yeah. I tend to bring on entrepreneurs because that's my network, but always open to outside people because I think we have a little something to learn from everyone.
So I'm thinking like your podcast, its intention is to add value to someone, and that someone is an entrepreneur that you could support with the marketing expertise that you have. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I would say so. And I think there's a certain clientele that I can't take on, wouldn't be able to invest properly in the services that we offer. And I've had that support. Hey, check out the podcast because there's a lot of great resources there. He preaches this. A lot of people preach this. I think it's important we have content out there that's based on our expertise. For that group that can't maybe afford what I do, they can at least listen to some of the expertise and some of the networks that I'm connected to that could help them level up faster so they could get to that point where maybe we can work together. So yes, sometimes it's going to convert to clients. Sometimes it's because I can't work with them and I want them to still succeed. And the podcast is a great place to send them.
That's really well put. And I'm thinking to myself, for example, when we have certain businesses, your business that supports entrepreneurs with marketing and your podcast that brings them into the funnel in a way, but also can add value to the ones that don't yet have the budget to work with you at that capacity, just to support them along the way, like Gary Vee mentioned. And it's just making me think about like when I'm getting guests on my podcast, there's 3 types of guests that I've gotten, depending on when I was doing like my real estate show or even right now, the podcast on podcasting, because I serve podcasters. And There's three types of guests that I generally will bring on. I'm not huge on getting like the famous guest, so that's not one of my type of three. I don't really see the true value of that, although I can see that it adds exposure. But the three that I would use, like for example, would be someone who's worked with me. Like when I was doing real estate investing and we wanted to gain passive investors, I would bring somebody on who passively invests with me because it was kind of like social proof in a way that like, hey, I hired Adam, I'm doing well. And the person listening might also work with me. So bringing on my own clients is one of those types of people. Number two, bringing on people that kind of like serve my client, as long as it doesn't feel like contradicting what I'm saying or maybe even like competing in a way. I don't really believe in all that competition, but in some ways, I think it's beneficial to like bring somebody on who serves my perfect listener in a different way than I do because they have value to add to the listener. And the third one is kind of like actually bringing on somebody who's like in the beginning of their journey. And it sounds random, but it's like my thought process is I might actually work with that person I'm bringing on. They're a podcaster. You're a podcaster, Mike. You might hire us. Who knows, right? But it's like having somebody on who is my perfect avatar. Now we're getting along. Now we're having a conversation. I'm adding value to that guest. And it's possible that we might work together. And I'm just curious, like, when you decide to have somebody on your podcast, those are kind of my three main ones. What are your main one or main two or main three or main four types of people and why?
I think you bring up a great point, right? And I think we have to look at this in all aspects of our online presence, right? So for me, the podcast is simply just one pillar of that. So my criteria for the podcast is pretty low in a sense, right? Do you want to be on, like I said, I put the hook out there, you're an entrepreneur, and do you have a pulse, right? Like those would probably be, it's more people that want to say yes, because I see it somewhat as the networking event of my business, right? Or the networking event of my online presence. When you go to a conference, you'll see someone's name tag and you'll say, oh, hey, Adam. So Adam, I see you're a podcaster. Oh, tell me more about that. You know, or I want to learn about that. So I treat my podcast guests as like, if I bumped into them in a convention or in an event, would I read what's on their name tag and on their basically maybe title that they have? And would I be interested in engaging in a conversation with them? So like I said, if it's a skydiver, I'd be like, oh, that's interesting, skydiver, but not really. So I kind of use that as the criteria. Whereas maybe there's other aspects of my, maybe on my LinkedIn, or if I'm going to write an article and interview somebody, like the criteria is maybe a little bit different. But the podcast, I keep it pretty wide open because for me, it's like walking into that massive networking conference or that conference or event and you see someone's name tag and you just strike up conversation. So that's kind of the criteria that I've used. May seem like a little bit of a low set bar, but it's made it fun for me. And like I said, it's kind of the aspect that I've taken with the podcast is it's a form of networking and communication. And that's what I look for when I do it.
Awesome. I love that. How about the when? Do you record on a certain day? Do you batch your recordings? How does that work?
When is an interesting animal. Obviously, I like to do it around this time of day because as you can see, how normally my kids will be in school, the house is quiet, there's nothing going on. So I usually try to do later in the week because that's when my week tends to slow down a little bit. So Wednesday, Thursdays, I try to do it. Fridays, I try to do as little as possible on Fridays because that's when I start to get ready for family and weekend and I totally shut down. I do it for a while recording at night and I just didn't like that, to be honest with you, because I really feel like I wanted to commit to the time and by the end of the day, I didn't have the energy. So I love recording during the day. I try to do it usually 2-3 times a week. If I get a good batch of episodes, I do interviews a lot. So usually I'll do a run where for 2 weeks I will record and then I'll have a good batch of episodes because we release once a week. So I'll usually record every other month. I'll do guest interviews. Usually, ironically, though, when I do my solo episodes, because I like to ramble a little bit, I like to have a cigar while I do it sometimes, and I tend to record those at night. So my solo episodes will be in the evening by myself. But if I'm doing a guest interview, I really want to be attentive and be with them. I just find the daytime works best for that, usually.
Love it. How about where do you record these guest interviews? So you're getting a guest. Do you have a studio that you need to come to regardless if they fly in or drive in?
No, like I said, this is one component of kind of my social media presence that I believe in. I keep it as casual as I like to keep my networking. So it's done right here on Zoom as I'm talking to you in my little office that's built in my garage. So it's not anything fancy or special. And it's funny you say that because we had an office and then obviously with COVID, everyone went remote and it's just really worked. I'm actually closing down the office. I highly considered making it a podcasting studio, but it just, the numbers and the time and effort I wanted to put into it just didn't add up. So would I like to get to that point in someday? But I think I think if you want to scale and you want to be professional and you really want to go out, you want to be Joe Rogan or you want to be someone that's really out there, definitely build a studio, go all the way. I'm doing this as kind of like, I wouldn't say a hobby, but an aspect. I like the casualness of it. So I tend to do it in my home office. I do most of my interviews over Zoom. When I do one little, and I guess this is kind of like a pro trick. If I want to go to a conference, I very rarely pay for them nowadays at all because I register as a media with my podcast. And I also do interviews there. So I found that's a great way, once again, I call it like pre-networking. So here, I don't even have to set meetings when I go to a conference. I get in touch with, submit for a press pass. I get the press pass. They send you everybody that wants to be interviewed. So it's been a great form of networking. Like I said, even if I don't need to get to know the people. So those I usually do on site. So I've done that for a couple of conferences where I've signed up for that. And usually, obviously, you can't do that at a podcasting conference. But if I've gone to an education conference or I have clients that are in telecommunication area, or it's harder to do with like an entrepreneur conference, but usually a venue or a trade show, I've been able to do that. And that's the other place I'll do the recordings. I'll do them there, or before the event, they're sending me people to interview beforehand to help promote or hype the event.
So cool. I love that. I've got you quoted. If I want to go to a conference, I very rarely pay for them because of the press pass. That's just so rad. I've never really thought about that. I've seen a couple of podcasters that did get a press pass, and I do remember them saying that you don't pay when they did that. So that's really cool. I love it. We're going to take a break. In a moment, I am going to want for you to just pour into our listener, imagining as if they're either about to start a podcast and they need to know some of the stuff you've learned over the last 2.5 years, or they're in the beginning stages of their podcast and they're needing to kind of take it to the next level. So that's where I want to go with the direction of this episode. Yeah. But I do think that it is that you mentioned some really cool things when we asked who, how, why, when, and where with getting guests. You said that with a guest, the who is basically any entrepreneur with a pulse. You're not too picky, and it's just people who've done it or they're in the trenches. How you get them was really valuable. You mentioned that the initial guest, that was your friends. That was the people that were already kind of like in your network. You already knew them and you invited them first. And that was like kind of like dipping your toe in the water, an easy, approachable way of getting your first guest. But that kind of morphed into utilizing your social media presence, like Facebook or whatever. And then you got, what was it? Podbooker, Podmatch, one of these like
Podbooker,
groups where lots of podcasters and people that want to be a guest on shows are meeting and connecting. So we'll make sure those links are also in the show notes. I am friends with the owners of both of them just because of this podcast, and they're just great people and great platforms. We use them as well. And then you said that kind of like the ninja strategy, that second step that you have been doing recently, and you even gave us the quote for that, which was exactly how you're getting more people through recommendations or referrals for your show. And I thought that was really, really cool. Like asking somebody, hey, do you want to come on my show, or do you know anybody else? Hey, I wanted to invite you and anyone you can think of. Like, hey, you already were on my show. Who else would you recommend? Those types of things to be able to get more guests. And now we don't have to stress about it. So you gave tons of tangible, actionable takeaways. Why you select those entrepreneurs is mainly to connect, is to have conversations, to network, and to add value to the world as well, like to bring those conversations to other people. And then you mentioned that you do it like 2 to 3 times. You'll like have 2 to 3 episodes that you might record, but you'll try to batch them. So it's only like every other month, and you'll do like your solo episodes that way. And I thought that was really valuable as well. And then finally, you mentioned that you kind of do it you do these interviews more virtually, usually over Zoom and just in the home office that you built in the garage. So a lot of really cool stuff. That press pass was super, super valuable. I'm about to just get into your like top advice for new and aspiring podcasters. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. Hey, my friend, as you know, this episode is sponsored by my company, GrowYourShow.com. We want you to be able to have the best tools at your disposal without costing you a whole arm and a leg. So right now you can get a free list of vetted equipment that like mics, mixers, webcams, sound treatment, editing software, everything that you need. I created the whole PDF with direct purchase links just to save you time and money, to help it be more convenient for you. So this free PDF will help you skip all the guesswork. If it's on there, it's vetted and approved by yours truly. And if it's not on there, it's probably not worth the money. So go ahead and get yours at growyourshow.com/PDF. Let's get back into the show. And we're back with Mike Ficara from the Start Down podcast. And I mentioned before we took a quick break that I'm just going to get his top advice. But he had mentioned before we started recording about the name of the podcast, the Start Down podcast. He mentioned there was like a reason why he titled it that. So I'll ask him both questions. Mike, just share with us how you came up with the title of the podcast, what it means to you, why you did that, and then just share your top advice to a new or aspiring podcaster.
Yeah, so the name comes from, we all know startups, right? And a startup, and I think people say, I'm working in a startup or working on a startup. That bar is set pretty low, right? Like anyone could say they're doing that, and it's an idea, and it's beautiful, and I love it. But the start down to me is where the real work happens, right? When you get in there, when you get in the dirt, you succeed or fail in what you learn. And that's why I called it the start down, because I think we're hearing from people and their stories. And that's kind of why I did sort of that play on words, if you will. I think advice for newly people or people looking to get into podcasting, and this is my advice to anybody who's starting anything new and getting in, is to avoid at absolutely all costs whatsoever perfection. Stop trying to be perfect. Don't worry about, do I have enough questions? Is it long enough? How does it sound? Do I do this? Do I do that? Just get out there and do it, man. Just start it. See what it's like. See the organicness of it. See what the feedback from people are. See who listens, who doesn't, what works, what doesn't work. And I think when I say avoid perfection from the start, I think a lot of people don't start something because they wait for it to be perfect. After you've been doing it for a while, then look at the game film. Then say, okay, this is how I did this there. I say too much, or I do this too much, or whatever it is. Look at your progress afterwards and then make the changes. I think so many people try to plan ahead before they start because they're like, oh, I'm going to research and do all this stuff and figure it out. And then you get in there, and when all that work, pre-work you did doesn't work out, how do you know? I'm a big fan of just learn by doing. I'm not a big fire ready aim guy, but I am a big learn by doing guy. So that would be my advice to newly started people. I think if you really want to grow and scale your podcast, or you're someone that's like, hey, I've been doing this for a while and I don't know what next. And listen, it's tough for me to give this advice because I think I'm a little guilty of it. I'm 155 episodes in, and for me to give you a real answer of like what I expect this to be or what I want it to be or where it's going, I really don't have an answer, but I love doing it. And I think it's working and it's consistent with the other pillars I have in my brand of what I do on social media, the book I wrote, like Socks on a Rooster. It lines up with that. So I continue to do it because I believe it's like exercising. Why those guys that work out and don't work out their legs, but work out their upper body and look ridiculous. I feel like if I wasn't doing a podcast, everything else I'm doing would look a little ridiculous. So this advice comes a little bit from the outside because I don't think I've chosen my complete direction yet, but I believe in anything. If you wanted to grow and scale, you have to take the minutia of what you're doing with it off your plate. So if you're still editing your podcast, if you're creating your sizzles for social media, if you're doing your logo design and your graphics and your branding, I mean, if you really want to grow and scale your podcast, you need to take all the little stuff that you're doing off your plate, outsource that to someone else, hire a team, have them help manage that for you. And then look at, when it comes to the podcasting itself, what's the things I'm really good at and where do I need to improve, and double down on those things. But I think looking at that and doing that, because I don't believe that you can grow and scale doing it all on your own in any business, whether it's podcasting or you're trying to grow your business. If you're still doing everything and you don't have a team, it's never going to grow.
So there was a lot of really good advice that you mentioned. I do have like a follow-up question as well. One of the things that you mentioned was that really ultimately, as we're kind of like starting a podcast, you can tell that a lot of people neglect doing something that's really important to them because they care too much about perfection. And you also mentioned that there's a lot of people that are probably trying to do it all that minutia, all of the hard work is all on their plate, and they're not willing or ready to kind of like offload some of the things that are kind of like out of their genius zone to somebody who could do it faster, cheaper, better. So those are just two wonderful takeaways. A, you don't have to necessarily be perfect right after the get-go. We can grow. We can stop saying And number two, offloading the minutia to somebody else's plate who might be more well-equipped for it so we can focus on what we're doing. I'm curious, just because for me, I didn't dare delete the episodes because I didn't want to be judged, which is the real truth. That's why I didn't want to delete them. But now they're gone because my old podcast has like over 600 episodes, and like you can't have all of the 600 showing up at the exact same time. So I'm curious, randomly, you mentioned earlier that like your first few episodes were kind of like Facebook Live episodes, and maybe they weren't perfect. Maybe you did say back then. Did you end up deleting or wanting to delete or trying to delete those old episodes that maybe made you cringe? And should the listener expect to maybe cringe or delete their episodes or keep them up no matter what? Like, what are your thoughts there? Just out of curiosity, since you are an advocate for go ahead and just getting it started.
I'll give you this analogy, Adam, because I'm a big analogy guy. That's my team. I always do this all the time. I don't know. You're married. I know you say you have a kid. You're married.
Not married. My ex and I are separated, and I've been dating the same. My sweetheart, I always call her, because we are partners, but we don't live together yet. She's got 2 daughters. I've got 2 boys.
Awesome.
But you may as well say we're married, because it has been years and we're life partners for sure.
All right. You ever take a picture of her?
All the time. I think she's so beautiful.
And usually afterwards, she tells you, I like it. I don't like it.
Yes.
Post it. Don't post it. Right? Don't you get feedback on that picture?
Yeah, there's all the time where I definitely need to post it because I'm like, oh, and she's like, no, don't post that. No, you can't put that on social. Yeah, you're right.
Now, I have an app on my phone called Timehop. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's an app that every day it gives you the history of what you've done on Facebook and your camera roll and everything. And it pulls whatever you posted as many years back as it goes. So the funny thing is, I have it on my phone. My kids actually have it on their phone because they get a kick out of it. But I'll go back to a picture that my wife, and I'll be like, hey, honey, look at this picture from 7 years ago or 8 years ago. And she's like, oh, wow. She goes, I remember hating that picture, but it looks really good now. Like, why did I think that picture didn't look good? Like, why did I think that it wasn't good to post, or I like how I look, or I look younger there, or whatever it is? I think that, and the reason I give that analogy is I think in the moment, we may not see the value in the content. In the moment, we may think that it's bad or we should delete it or it's cringeworthy or whatever it is, even if it's your older stuff and even the stuff I did. But I don't know. The podcast isn't about me, and it's about my audience. And I don't know what my audience needs, everyone that's listening. So for me to take it down because I don't like it, I think it would be selfish. And this is just me personally. I leave it up there because I think that, and like you said, every picture you take of your sweetheart, she's beautiful and you love it. She may not like it, but it means a lot to you. You know what I mean? Even my wife, she may not have that picture, but I loved it. It meant a lot to me. So I leave the episodes up because I don't know what will and will not resonate with my audience. I may have one that was a fake post live with crappy audio, but maybe I said one thing in there that's going to help somebody take their business to the next level or get them out of a funk or whatever it is. So I selfishly I think taking them down would be selfish. So I leave them up there for my audience more than for me, because it's not, the podcast isn't about me. It's about my audience.
Podcast isn't about me. It's about my audience. We create a quote card, Mike. Every time we have an episode, we always create a quote card. That's what I want your quote. The podcast isn't about me. It's about my audience. So my team, whenever like after this, they'll like create some promotional materials. They'll send you stuff. I don't know if that's what they'll use. I hope it is, because I just think it is so on point. And it's like mic drop, boom. That was so true and so valuable. And I liked how you feel like it's almost selfish to take down some of that content because it could be valuable and supportive to your listener. Really good stuff. So, hey, this is Mike Ficara joining us on the podcast. I'm your host, Adam A. Adams, and the podcast that he started a little over 2.5 years ago is called the Start Down Podcast. The Start Down Podcast. So join him, like find the link that it's already in the show notes. Scroll down, click it, jump over there and see what you think of it. And if you love it, give him an honest written review. Like let him know what you think and tell him that you heard about him from here. That would be an honor for me to see that as well. Mike, appreciate you. Your son has been so good, like so good during this. I saw him come on camera for a second, but man, he's been awesome. So give him some kudos for me and from the listener as well. Appreciate you. And I hope the listener finds you on your podcast. You've added a ton of value to us today, talking about getting guests and like what you've gone about to be able to get guests. The untangible or unknown values that you've gotten from podcasting, where it's like going to conferences for free, having your own little masterclass, being recognized when you go to these conferences immediately, having people come up to you and letting you know that they listen to your podcast. And additionally, just like the thought process of not worrying about being perfect. It's not about you, it's about the listener. And so who cares? And secondly, the thought process of like offloading some of this hard stuff. There was a lot of tangible takeaways that me and the listener were able to grow because of your unselfish, supportive value where you're just here to pour into us. So I just want to say thank you on behalf of me and the listener today.
Yeah, no, and big thank you to you and your listeners. I appreciate you having me on and taking the time to record this, and more importantly, everyone who's listening. So, and those of you listening on 1x speed, I really appreciate you because that's
on 1x. I listen on 2x almost every single podcast. That's so random. That's so random you bring that up. So we serve podcasters. And so like we'll have what's called a discovery call. Like somebody will connect with us through the podcast or whatever. And a lot of times I'll pull up their podcast to play it for them. And it's on 2x speed. And I forget to think about it ahead of time. And they're like, whoa, I sound like a chipmunk. What's going on? And I'm like, oh, sorry. And let me turn this to 1x. And I'm like, it's so slow. It's so funny that you and I both, we're not grammar Nazis. We don't care so much about the grammar, some of those other things, but like we enjoy the podcast and we have that other thing in common where we have to listen on 2x speed. That's
I love that, man. That's the way to do it.
Cool, man. All right. Thank you for joining me on the show today. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate it.
Laters. You know, I really don't say this nearly enough. I don't mention this and I feel horrible because it's a great resource for you to be able to take your podcast to the next level. And it's simply a free resource that I don't need your email or anything. It's just a podcasting course that I created that is ended up putting in the very first 6 episodes of this podcast. So if you haven't checked it out, definitely going to want to just check out those first 6 episodes, see how they can help you improve your podcast, get in front of more people, and have a better result where you're making more money through the podcast, etc. So much can happen after you listen through episodes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So if you haven't done it, go do it now. And by the way, if you're subscribed, you'll keep hearing more great content. So to those of you who are, I'll see you on the next episode.